My name is Michelle Wiebe, and this is my show, The Scene Between. I wanted to create a show like this for a few reasons. First of all, I wanted to experiment with taking a visual object, so in this case a little lino-cut block, and use it how somebody would use a piece of lead type or text. So I wanted to have a project where I could take the same blocks that I've carved, but use them in different ways, in different combinations. Typically, when you're working with lino-cut printmaking, you have one block, your matrix, and that is used to just create the image, and once you're done creating that image, that block is finished. And I wanted to push that idea into something where these were endlessly interchangeable. I could print them for forever if I wanted to, but that I would be doing it in such a way that it would never be the same thing twice. And so the core of this whole project is essentially these little blocks, and I talk about them as my long blocks because unlike a typical lino-cut block, which is, a square or a nice, wide rectangle, these are 1 inch wide and I think they're 9 inches long. And so they're just these long bars that I can do all sorts of different things with. So every single piece that's in this show, those blocks make an appearance. But sometimes they're really, really obvious, like the pieces behind me. But sometimes they're buried underneath and they're almost fighting with the layers of paint above them to make their point. So it's been an interesting way of working because it is really an unconventional approach to lino-cut printmaking and mixed media in general. Lino-cut printmaking is a really old art form. Well, not really old. It's sort of a modern twist to woodcut or like a wood block print, which that's a very old art form. Lino-cut is using what was originally made for flooring. Is just a very flat, hard surface that you take gouges and you carve your image into that surface. And so when you're making a lino-cut, the actual thing that you're making isn't the work of art. It's just a matrix that you use to print off of. So you would take that block that you've carved your image in, you put a layer of ink over top of it, and then you press it into paper. So sometimes it's done by hand and you might burnish it with a spoon. Sometimes it's done with a machine. Now I have a particular niche with lino-cut printmaking in the sense that I use traditional letterpress printing. So a letterpress machine is, you think back to Gutenberg in the 15th century, those are the machines that have movable types. So lead typeface is really what you're using in those, if you're being a purist. I'm not. So instead, I'm putting these lino cuts that I've made into these machines and I'm printing them on something that has the capacity to print thousands of copies of this, should I want to. Not that I'm doing that. So with this show, this is also a showcase of letterpress printmaking as well. Oh, I love color. So when I decided to work with these pieces, that was something I really wanted to push with each of them, is just vibrancy. What happens when you juxtapose one color next to another, as opposed to, say, working in a representational way where, this area is green, the sky is blue. With this, there were no rules. And so it was really fun to go through and just pop colors. The other thing is I love fluorescent. And I invested in some fluorescent letterpress ink. So letterpress ink is not something that you can go to the local art store and just purchase off the shelf. You have to pay to ship it and it's expensive. And so this was something that I was really excited about when I started this project, was that I've got this bucket full of fluorescent colors, and so that was actually a core element to this body of work, is that there's a lot of neon. Some of it I've toned it down, but it's there. It's under the surface, and so yeah, it was a lot of fun. And these are very different colors than I typically work with, and again, I wanted to challenge myself, not get stuck in a you know, this is my palette, this is how I work. I decided to throw that out the window for this whole year, and instead just pop color. One of the biggest changes in my work in the last, I'd say maybe 2 years, has been that 3 years ago it was discovered that I had a brain tumor that was fairly significant. So it was about the size of a plum, and I had surgery to remove it. And yeah, so that was a fun first year to recover. And because of where this brain tumor was on my parietal lobe and on my occipital lobe. So your occipital lobe is responsible for your vision. And your parietal lobe, I learned later on, has a lot to do with ordering things and putting like kind of making sense of the world. And so when I had surgery and I came through that, I actually had to relearn how to paint. I couldn't do that for a little while. I could draw, but painting was really, really difficult for me because it was all layers and anticipating what's going to go above it. And I found that to be really challenging. It was almost like there was too many moving parts within one piece. The other thing that was affecting me is for a couple of years leading up to this discovery of my brain tumor, it was there for a really long time. So it started to really slowly make things difficult. That's why we didn't notice it right away. I actually lost the ability to do abstract thinking. So taking something and making a visual item that is not from reality would have been really challenging for me. And I'm somebody who's, ever since I was in art school, I love symbolism. I love abstract work. I love conceptual artwork. And for a long time, I wanted to pursue it, and then it just got harder and harder, and then it was impossible. So then I came through, I had surgery, I recovered, regained my skill to paint, and realized that I still can't visualize things in an abstract way. That part of my brain is kind of different now. But what I can do is access another part of my parietal lobe that I didn't realize was a strength. So words. I love words. I love thinking through ideas. So to have this work that is abstract in nature, this didn't come out of me imagining this. This came out of reading. It came out of conversations. It came out of writing things down and reflecting on ideas and thinking of names and thinking of meaning, and then putting things down and reacting to them on the canvas. So it was that conversation coming out as I was working, where these ideas were forefront, and I was able to do that. So it was actually a really neat byproduct of having brain surgery, was the ability to actually return to this more conceptual, more idea-driven artwork. The inspiration for these prints is exploring my family history. I grew up in a family where we really didn't have a lot of contact with extended relatives, partly because all my grandparents had passed away before I was born. The other part was just being across the country, so not near aunts and uncles and cousins, not really having those chances to interact and share family stories or reminisce about the past. And it never bothered me growing up to not have had that contact, because that was my reality. But it wasn't until I married into my husband's family, which is a huge family and lots of siblings, and I realized after being married a few years that I actually know more about my husband's family history than I did my own. And So that kind of started to percolate, and I wanted to explore. My mother's side is Scottish, my father's side is French and Ojibwe. And so through conversations and then also just looking at the lack of information that I had, I decided to explore that as the theme of all these pieces here, is just trying to uncover names, memories, even things like a lot of people take for granted that they may look like an uncle, or they may have the same laugh as, somebody's deceased aunt or whatever. And it was those sorts of things that I really wanted to take apart and examine as an artist. And so that's sort of the loose themes that are going on with all these series. With this show, also, I wanted to work in small series as opposed to having a grand vision where it was, I'm going to make 100 pieces in 100 days, and I thought instead I would pursue in one direction, and when I reached the natural conclusion of that direction, then I would feel comfortable with not exploring it anymore. So there's different amounts of pieces as well in each of these series, because some of them, the point could be made in 10 pieces, and others, I actually don't know if I'm finished some of these series as well. So. Buried in all of these pieces are references to First Nations culture. Some of that is represented in the colors, in the sense that I wanted to pay homage to things like beadwork. That's especially an important feature to this. These blocks, when I carved them, the inspiration from the blocks themselves are actually from I guess it would be 18th century bandolier bags. So a bandolier bag is an import that was brought from Europe to North America and by the settlers, and what it was meant for is ammunition. So it was an ammunition pouch, and as the French settlers intermixed with local cultures, that was actually that and beads were something that actually was brought to First Nations people, which was a really interesting idea to me. I know from a settler perspective, we can be quite influenced by First Nations artwork and be very inspired by it, but it was also neat to go back to this early interaction and see that there was also inspiration from Europe for First Nations people. And so these bandolier bags, they are beaded, and they have patterns and they have motifs that are repeated. There's some of them I think are more of a decorative thing. Some of them were influenced by European design, and then others have great meaning to them and stories behind them. And so part of my job with this was to look at those things, understand it was part of my family's history, but also be really respectful that this is not my culture. I was not raised in this culture. It, in my mind, is not, it's not wise to just assume that even if you have this as your background, it's not wise to assume that these are yours to have and to, display in this way. And so I looked at that as an inspiration, and then I carved my long blocks, those lino-cut blocks, with patterns that were inspired by this, but also not mimicking exactly, not these perfect replicas. I wanted to use them in a very non-traditional way. It wasn't like I wanted to make ceremonial pouches or anything like that or confuse the issue. So I took that inspiration, removed it, altered it, and then made it into a totally different application. And I wanted to do my best to reflect that element of that part of my heritage without, making claims to making First Nations art that I don't believe I can make. That's just a personal opinion on this. So, yeah. There's other elements from other cultures buried in there as well, but there's definitely a First Nations nod with the colors and then with the way the blocks are carved. Yeah, so one of the things that came very clear at the beginning of this process is, as I was looking at my family's history and trying to figure out a way of respectfully addressing the First Nation side of my family without assuming an identity that wasn't mine. This is really, really important. I am deeply proud of my First Nations heritage, but I wasn't raised in that culture. And I think many Canadians struggle with how to express their pride and how to express their desire and their longing for what was lost. So, and it's not necessarily First Nations. This can span, you know, moving and immigrating to Canada, which part of my family did. Part of this definitely speaks to having almost like a cultural erasure, and having my family, at least on my father's side, raising children with the actual threat of residential schooling, raising their children in a world that was unfriendly towards First Nations people. And so there's a really fine line to walk where you're expressing your love for this heritage and this history without romanticizing it, without doing things that would really be culturally offensive. And so with this work, my greatest challenge with it, and also the most rewarding part of this work, was figuring out a way to talk about the First Nation side of my family, Ojibwe, doing it justice, doing something that's original, and not erasing it. Because this is the danger of when people are afraid of talking about, like in their art. So I'm not talking about like afraid of talking about having, you know, First Nations background, but more of like, oh, I'm so scared of touching this because of appropriation concerns, which are legitimate and real. And I do feel that great care needs to be made. And I do think that people who are willing to walk forward in exploring this visually should really take quite a bit of time to not only understand what appropriation is, but also to understand subjects like systemic racism, to understand the damage that can be caused by being insensitive as you're moving forward with creating these works. The other thing is I don't feel like it's my place to do things like apply for grants that are meant for people who are Métis, First Nations, Inuit. There's lots of grants out there. I don't need those grants. I don't market or sell my art under the banner of First Nations artwork. That's my heritage, but that's not my culture currently. So that is something that I feel I'm able to speak to my family's history without making it more or less than what it actually is, and to prevent further erosion and erasure of that culture. Because this is something that, you know, art and languages are disappearing, and if people are slightly removed from that culture and they have those interests in maybe learning Cree or learning you know, beadwork or whatever, because of a personal interest and a connection, but also in order to move that further into the future, I feel like this is a way of bridging that gap. So not leaving things in the past so that they're forgotten, but rather bringing it up and doing it differently and acknowledging that there is a gap and a distance there, but definitely celebrating it. So. One of the things that went into this as well is I did take quite a bit of time. So I'm researching, trying to figure out my family, looking at, ethical considerations of different cultures, of, bringing in elements and how to do that in a way that is respectful. And I found a lot of this work was it was cathartic as an artist to go through. I had a couple friends that I could sit down and kind of talk through these ideas, which is strangely part of the process for me. It's not always just, I'm going to make these things and I sit in my studio and they just happen. A lot of times I have to sit down and say, like, what am I trying to say? Where am I going with this? Does this seem weird? What do I want to do? And so there's been a lot of ingesting information, written, watching things, whatever, like just kind of an educational process. And then there's been a rumination process in my head internally of like, where do I want to go with this? What am I trying to say with this? As well as this process of putting it out there to somebody and listening to their feedback and genuinely listening to it, not just like, pat on the back stuff, but like, oh yeah, that could look really, no, you're right. I need to reconsider this. I need to understand this element better. And so this body of work took me a year, and it's really not only a conversation with the actual individual works on paper or on board, but it's a conversation with ideas as well as what does family mean? What does culture mean? What does symbolism, do for this piece? So there's a lot of stuff going on within the pieces themselves. Another thing that's important about these pieces is their names. So their names, if I could do Untitled 1, Untitled 2, Untitled 3, I would absolutely do that. But I've learned over the years that is a nightmare for inventory. It's also kind of boring. So the names of these pieces and what that reflects, a lot of these talk about isolation and distance and fragmentation within a family as well. The biggest thing that I think people can take away from this exhibition, although it's personal work, and so a lot of this is reflected upon my experience and my family's history, this is a body of work about being an outsider and about losing culture, about trying to make connections that are really hard to make. And so there's a both and going on here. It's a personal body of work, but I do think it speaks to people who feel lost, who feel disconnected, who feel like they want to, reestablish some sort of something with either extended family or culturally or whatever it is. And I think those feelings are more common than people realize, especially with Canadian culture, because we are kind of a melting pot, blended, mosaic sort of culture. There's definitely a Canadian flavor that is prevalent in our culture, but there's also a lot of broken ties, and there's a lot of things that people had to say or do in order to fit that almost Anglo-Saxon mold. And so this body of work is also, my way of trying to express that desire that I think other people would relate to quite a bit, especially if they do look back to their, family history and they know that there's just distance there in some way.
Thank you, Michelle. That was wonderful.